On this week's episode, we are going to be dealing with the mass casualty event that happened in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. So I just wanted to offer a trigger warning ahead of that. We are also going to be talking about mental health issues, including suicide and other self-harm topics. So please be warned. We have chosen to not name the victims in this tragic event. They are available at news sources in Canada here at CBC, Globe and Mail, different news sources. We haven't spoken to any of the family members, so we did not want to name them, but we recognize that they are not just numbers or statistics. They are people, and this is a huge loss for our country. We will mention, you will hear myself mention at times, a couple of times the shooter's name, specifically because there have been many instances already where there have been different names that have been floated out throughout social media. Misinformation was spread, and simply just to clarify who we are speaking about. But we did try to minimize that as well and talk about it just in the context of misinformation online. So please take care if any of this subject matter is not something that you're in a place to listen to this week. We completely understand. Welcome to 49 Clicks. It is a show that we do every week here where three friends talk about the news and try to process them together. And this week, more than most, is, I think, a great chance for us to talk to the people in our community, in our friend groups, and try to work through just a really awful week here in Canada. I'm joined by my friend Marta. Say hi, Marta.
Hi everyone.
And my friend Bailey. Say hi, Bailey.
Hello.
So today on the show, we are going to, we had a whole rundown of what we were going to talk about in news this week, but obviously other events came up and we have decided to ditch our regular segments and just dedicate probably a much shorter show to just discussing what happened this week in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. Both Bailey and myself do live in BC. This has been heartfelt not just by people in BC and obviously in the northeast part of BC, but across this country. If for anybody who's not aware, we are recording this on Thursday, February 12th, around 6 p.m. Pacific. This week in Tumbler Bridge, there was the largest mass casualty event in Canadian history. 9 people died and 28 people were injured in a mass shooting event. Canada, it is very infrequent that we have mass shooting events in this country. Of course, we did have the École Polytechnique shooting in 1989, which had 29 people injured or deceased. And of course, in Nova Scotia, the event that had 25 casualties there. So this has been an extremely difficult week, to say the least, for people in this country, and everything is still very fresh. Details are still emerging. So we are going to try to process this together a little bit. Maybe that helps some of you at home as well. Try to um, make sense of something senseless and awful that really is just I don't really have words. So we're going to try to work through some of this together, and hopefully you'll join us as well. Ladies, how it seems like a silly question, but how are you doing?
Well, um, it definitely it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. I think that it really, really hit me hard last night and today. I also I'm at a loss of what to say, really. I'm devastated. Like you said, this rarely happens in Canada, so when it does, it's very shocking and it makes me incredibly sad. And I'm just thinking about the victims and their families and how much pain they must be experiencing right now. So, yeah, I'm still kind of processing everything.
Yeah, I think same over here. I have to admit, I recognize that I'm still in a bit of shock. I'm somebody that in a crisis, because as you said, we're not super familiar as Canadians with this type of event happening in Canada. But in general, in a crisis, I do find myself reflexively going into action. So I did find myself doing that a lot this week. Like, okay, this has happened. What can I do? How can I be helpful? What is helpful? What isn't helpful? Um, and I have to admit, I'm bracing a bit. I'm sure it'll hit on a different level if I think about it too much. But yeah, I'm definitely in my head about it. If there are any other people who like intellectualize their feelings first, you are in very good company. I
Yeah.
am right there with you. So, so yeah, I have to admit, like for me, part of my processing has been like, okay, what are the stats? What are the communities impacted? How can I be of service or not?
Yeah, it's very it's been a very odd week when we talk about responses, not only just our own personal response. All three of us are content creators, we all have our platforms on TikTok and Threads and YouTube and everything else. And I think for me, one of the one of the most frustrating things to see right away, because we had all been talking amongst ourselves, as I'm sure people were talking to their friends and family across the country, as details emerged. But in between all of that, I was starting to see it light up on social media, and I was I I didn't want to make I didn't want to make content about this. I didn't want to talk about it. Um, but I started seeing people be harmful, spreading misinformation. The police hadn't confirmed early on when it happened, the police had not confirmed how many people were involved, what was going on. There was still a lot of unknown information, and I was watching the police live press conferences and updates and watching the news. And the news that I was seeing on my television screen from, global news, from the RCMP directly, was so drastically different than what I was seeing on my TikTok screen. And
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that I was gonna bring that up, because I had barely just heard that it had happened, and already I saw people that were very quick to hop online and start reporting, and I use that term very loosely because there was barely any info available to the public, and it really didn't sit right with me. I know that a lot of people were making good videos and actually reporting that, this had happened, and made it a point to say details are not yet known. And, like you were, Kat, I know you made some videos calling out the misinformation and reminding people that the details haven't been released. So it's really important that we're responsible when we talk about this online.
yeah, the hard part for me, I mean, I had watched the 6 o'clock news. I had watched the press conferences. Obviously, in BC, it was consistent news that was rolling out. And by the time we were hitting around the 11 o'clock news, I had seen so many people spreading not just misinformation, like that was sort of like, oh, I heard it was this many, or I heard it was like that kind of thing, but people immediately took it upon themselves to start social media sleuthing. They were going, there were people on lives, there were people making videos saying, well, this person was this thing, and I've seen their Instagram and I've seen their Facebook account, and I know they have a Reddit, and they were pulling out all kinds of information that had not been verified, that was not confirmed by police. And it was it got to a real fever pitch that a lot very early on in the online space started to be all about the identity of the shooter. That very quickly turned extremely ugly. As we now know, the shooter was 18 and had transitioned male to female about 6 years prior. So this was a person who identified as female. The RCMP has been very clear in all of their communication that this is a female. In the alerts that had gone out during the lockdown time, they had described the person as a female. And the RCMP has been very clear that they supported making sure that their identity and who they were was respected. Unfortunately, that was not the case. And what we were seeing with content creators who tried to jump on and be the first with news out there and started spreading really harmful rhetoric about the trans community. And so the only reason I went on and made a video was to say, this is the details we know by fact from the RCMP. Please stop speculating. Please stop spreading harmful things because, and I'm loath to repeat stuff that was said, but there was a lot of people who immediately invalidated their gender and started calling her a man in a dress and that kind of awful language that we hear. That was happening already before the police had released any information. It wouldn't have been
Yeah.
until the whole next day around like noon, there was a noon press conference the day after when the police finally came out and talked about the identity of the person.
I also saw creators posting some very insensitive videos, kind of like clickbait type videos. And to me, it seemed like the topic wasn't being approached with compassion, and that a lot of people were using this tragedy as an opportunity to get clicks, likes, and views. And so I think it's really important that you did post those videos, Kat, to point out, like, hey, we need to be more responsible when we are posting about this. We need to have confirmed details before we speculate on things because it's important to remember that there are people on TikTok that are likely from that community that are watching these videos.
Mhm.
I myself have received comments and messages from people in the community. And so when people are posting these videos, it's so important to remember that family members of the victims are potentially watching.
I think there's a huge difference between content creators relaying news from official news sources in a way that does communicate to their audience what is happening. As we know, unfortunately, like the type of thing that is shared on social media that gets a lot of views, gets a lot of traction, often looks very different from, a professional news conference, and that's valid. I think it's really great to hear, from directly from individuals that in like a very low key context. But I just think it's so important that those creators in those moments, especially, are citing their sources and referring people back to the sources for full context. So even if you are pulling something from a CBC News article, you want to make sure people have the information. Just like I really wish more content creators would refer them back to that original source material so that people can get that context.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah.
agree. There was also so much, there was so many people who jumped to, I'm an expert, I'm the one solving this, and like true crime detective hats on that started
Mhm.
just digging into all over the place. And we even saw like the CBC got something wrong. Radio Canada, they got it wrong. They put up the photograph of somebody totally different, like a completely different trans individual who has now not been able to leave their home. Reports that I've read has said that they've been afraid to leave because they've been misidentified in a national news story, and the correction didn't happen until over 20 hours later. And that's the kind of thing that makes me really upset. We also saw in BC here that same evening, one of our MLAs, if you're not from BC, it's our member of Legislative Assembly, Tara Armstrong, she went out and put something really heinous on X, and I'll put it up here, um, and immediately politicized this. She immediately took, while we still didn't have the proper numbers of both the dead and injured, while we still didn't know what had gone on, she was out there politicizing this and railing against trans people, which it's so difficult because you want to have a conversation about this horrific shooting and mental health, which we will absolutely get to. But it's so hard because it's been so immediately derailed by bad actors, political groups that have special interest targets against the trans community, against the 2S LGBTQIA community, and they immediately jumped on this. And that is something that I have really been struggling with. And I know, like, I'm a straight woman. I'm not part of any part of the rainbow in that way. But I do have trans friends. I have worked with trans people as they've gone through their transition in adulthood, which I've watched and tried to be there for them as that has been very difficult. And I think a lot about how complicated it is to be in this moment where we have huge groups of people using a massive tragedy to further their hate. And after
Yeah,
posting just basic facts and then seeing what Tara posted and posting what Tara had said, I myself, just like a straight white privileged woman, in 24 hours, the amount of absolutely disgusting, vitriolic comments that I was sent on TikTok. And if I am getting that, which is probably 1% or a fraction of what people in that community are seeing, I can't even imagine. And it just makes me feel so hopeless. Like the amount of hate that I've seen, I don't even know how to contextualize it. I'm really struggling to process. And again, I'm not upset for myself. I don't care that I'm receiving it. I care that there are people out there that have this in their heart. It
yeah,
really upsets me.
I think with the Terra thing, first of all, if your reaction, your response to something like this is the same as Elon Musk's response, and you are depending on, your audience on Elon Musk's platform, you're in the wrong. More
definitely.
likely, you're on the wrong side of history. So, to that MLA, well, lots of stuff. But um yeah, that just as a side note, if anybody is concerned about like the public safety matter that is an MLA posting something like that, we can provide in the caption the contact for the Minister of Public Safety who might be interested in hearing about that. So, just as an aside, I'm throwing that out there
Definitely.
because I think it's for me even more than creators. I have to admit, just like looking to our leaders, people who have been either elected into leadership, people who are responsible for the platforms on which a lot of this hate lives, like those are the people that I am just zeroed in on.
Yeah, because this Tara Armstrong, she is representing, the people within her district.
Mhm.
Um, and her immediate reaction, instead of being compassionate and taking a moment to really sit with what happened, because the victims, they range in age from like 12 years old to 39 years old. those are some very young children. I can't believe that instead of showing compassion towards those victims and their families who are going through the worst time of their life right now, immediately she used this as a way to further her political agenda, and an MLA should absolutely not be doing that.
Hmm.
It is quite frankly disgusting to me,
Yep.
and it enrages me. Like when I saw that, I was so filled with anger, and I still am.
Yeah, it's been really difficult. I think for people who aren't from BC, and I know I get teased by my friends who live back east quite a bit that we're like all peace and love and rainbows and we are very hippies who are inclusive. For people who don't live here, they might not know that uh, we had a very interesting election, the last BC election, in which there used to be a party called the BC Liberal Party here in BC, but it was never a liberal, like it wasn't related to the federal liberals. It was a conservative right-wing party. They had been in power for quite a few years, but they always capitalized off the name liberal because people thought they were left-leaning like the federal party. They even had the same
Mhm.
colors. It was very confusing. And right before the last BC election, the leaders of that party decided, oh, you know what? People don't like Trudeau anymore, so we aren't benefiting from using this label. We're going to change the party's name. The party actually failed spectacularly, just disbanded before the election happened. And when that happened, it was left with the NDP and the Greens, and basically nobody else opposing them until a party was resurrected that was called the BC Conservative Party. The BC Conservative Party was really like a fringe, nobody took seats from it, teeny little party that didn't exist and has zero relationship to the Conservative Party of Canada. But what we saw instead, because there was this huge vacuum left, it was all of these very fringe conspiracy theory, anti-vaxxer, residential school denier candidates put their names forward for the BC Conservative Party. And that election ended up being extremely close. The NDP won, but the BC Conservative Party got a huge number of seats, which it's never had before. And Tara Armstrong was one of those candidates. We've seen a lot of problems since that election happened in BC, where there have been, Tara Armstrong has now moved to be an independent because some of these candidates who were so fringe, their ideas were so far into the fringe theory areas that they have now broken off into another party, which is called, I think it's 1BC is what they're calling it, which is even
Yeah.
more tendency towards like white nationalism and other very, very extreme views. One of those views is anti-trans views and pushing that kind of rhetoric. So to explain to people outside of this area how we could possibly have an MLA who was trying to capitalize on the situation, maybe that offers some context. Um,
It's
but
also it's really gross to me that I think she tweeted that, right? Like she
yeah,
tweeted that response. It was on Twitter.
yeah.
Yeah.
That she tweeted it the day it happened.
Hmm. Yeah. It was
The
like,
day
oh,
it happened. Like that is just so insensitive. And if you compare her immediate response to the statements that other politicians like, Mark Carney um has put out,
mhm.
there's such a difference there.
Even Vladimir Zelensky from Ukraine reached out.
Yes, I saw
Uh,
that. I actually just saw that, and I thought that was incredibly kind and compassionate of him.
I
Yeah.
think you bring up something really, really important, Marta, which is that she posted the day of. And I just
Yeah.
want to highlight for anybody listening who may not be aware of this, but this is something that we see a lot on the right, especially because when people, when something like this happens, and again, I want to emphasize yet again, this is incredibly rare in Canada, but we have obviously seen a lot of mass shooting events in the United States. But when something like this happens, emotions are very high. As we talked about, people are confused, disoriented. There's a lot going on. We're all kind of fight or flight. Our nervous system is in a totally different zone. And it is a very common tactic for these groups, these kind of fringe right groups, to jump, to pounce on that, even if it's inaccurate, even if they end up retracting it after the fact, even if they end up apologizing for it after the fact. The damage is done because it is like having this very open wound and then, having somebody come in and just like put salt in it immediately. Obviously, that's going to have more of an impact if it's an open
Yeah.
wound rather than one that's bandaged. So, yeah, it's definitely this is a well studied and well thought out tactic, and we've seen the success of it in the United States. Because it really does rile people's emotions, and whether we like it or not, we all have brains, and whether or not we're really, really smart individuals, they are just subject to what all brains are subject to, and brains work a certain way. And one of the ways that brains work is that when we hear something, when we're in a vulnerable state, it kind of runs with it, and it's really hard to get that narrative out of that brain again.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
definitely.
that's I think if you are a content creator listening and you're looking for something to do that is can be really helpful, as immediately after something is happening, that's why it's so important to very quickly direct people to the primary sources of information, right? Like if you have a large
Yes.
audience, something has just happened, you don't know what's happened, definitely you can make a post being like, hey, this thing has happened, to make sure that you're following CPC, make sure you're following the RCMP,
Mhm.
for more. And also reminding people, like, I try my best, but I definitely try to very quickly get something out that's just a gentle reminder to people to like take a pause, nervous
Hmm.
system stuff.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, sorry, I know that's like a little bit of a ramble and a spiel. It's just something I'm so passionate about, and it's something they've done so well, and I want to see something different for Canada. And honestly, I think that's where, like, this is where I find myself getting pretty emotional and choked up, because I know how events like this are used, and so that's where I think maybe a lot of my emotion and fear is. Sorry, guys.
Oh, it's
No,
okay.
don't be sorry. That brings up so many great points, Bailey.
I also just went and looked at Tara Armstrong's post just to give people a reference. The shooting details were breaking in the afternoon between like 2 and 5 p.m. is when I was getting the live updates. She
Yeah.
posted that at 9:38 p.m. on February 10th, the same day.
Wow.
So just hours later, and then she followed it up by further politicizing it the next day on February 11th, just after noon. So there was the noon press conference, and just after that again. And I'm just going to read this to you guys. Will David Eby take accountability for this transgender mass murder? After 9+ years of pushing radical gender ideology in schools and healthcare, will he finally
Huh.
repeal SOGI? Will he take any action at all? And then she included some graphics, like like bar graphs that are wrong, and links that are also propaganda and wrong. And I will say, if you are not familiar with SOGI, that is a framework that we use here in the province of British Columbia for our school systems. It's sexual orientation, gender identity. It is not a course, it's not like sex ed. It is a framework of education, sort of to talk about things. So, like, if you have a kid in your school who might have two moms, what kind of language do we use around that? It
Yeah.
helps everybody have like a basis respect line.
Hmm.
And in BC, we have seen, after the convoy happened and after the protests of anti-COVID protests were happening, in BC, we saw a huge sudden surge in anti-SOGI propaganda and protests. That happened, a lot of it happened in the city where I live in, where we had so much false propaganda that we had seen happen in like down in Florida, um, where there was certain, like, there's a book called Gender Queer, I believe. They were using propaganda that was based off of that book and changing it to show false images and sending it around in pamphlets here, and it resulted in a bunch of people pulling their kids out of school for a month. There was protests for over a year. There was such violent protests at our school board that they were like banging on the windows and the doors of the school board. I live in an extremely conservative town, an extremely right-wing conservative town. A city, I should say city. We're the largest city by area in the province of BC in Abbotsford, and I think the fourth largest by population. I think it's like 150,000 people. Um, and I think part of what has made me so, what has made this whole tragedy even more complicated for me personally, um, is seeing the rhetoric come out of somebody like Tara, who is currently sitting in office, knowing the harm that has been caused in my community, how unsafe it is to be part of the 2S LGBTQIA community here in Abbotsford. I have friends who have trans kids who have been bullied by adults at their own schools. Um, it is a very unsafe place right now, and so it's been very difficult to see a tragedy used to further bigoted political rhetoric. And I'm so mad that people are doing this. So, and
I was just wondering, was that the first post that Tara Armstrong posted about this situation?
um, let's see. I think it might have been.
Because that makes it, I mean, it's already like the worst thing
The,
somebody could say, but if that's the first thing she said without even acknowledging,
there was
like,
at 5:54, she put out two sentences. My deepest condolences to the victims in Tumbler Ridge, as well as to their families and the entire community. I stand with them in grief and support. And then at 9 o'clock, she wrote this entire giant, you can't see that,
Yep.
but giant
yeah.
diatribe just a few hours later. So
And and I just wanted to say, Kat, your feelings are so valid.
it's just been really hard because I've seen a lot of the um, I've lived in Abbotsford for 30 years and I've seen so much bigotry and hatred here. And since the 90s, when I was defending my gay friends, I figured that it would have changed by now. And for people who aren't familiar with this specific town in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, it is extremely right wing and it's very heavily evangelical, but more specifically, very Mennonite. And my experience within that community here, at least the people I went to school with, there is a lot of really very specific hatred for the gay community in general. And I know that in school, when students came out, people would scream at one of them that he was going to burn in hell, like in the like between English class and biology, and the teachers just let it go. So it was, and that was a public school. So there's a very large community here, including the, you know, historically people who have led this town that are quite bigoted that we are seeing again more recently.
And for those of you that don't know, I am actually Mennonite. My family comes mostly from Russia, like my grandparents. And what people might not realize is Mennonites, being Mennonite, it's considered like an ethno religion. So it's an ethnicity, but it is also a religion. So while I am Mennonite, I am not religiously a Mennonite. I'm not religious. I am ethnically a Mennonite, I guess. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. And so I have a lot of experience growing up around Mennonites. I actually will probably speak about this in upcoming episodes. I consider myself an ex-cult member because I was raised in this religion and I do consider it to be a cult. Now, I know there are a lot of different types of Mennonites, and some are very progressive, and I love that. But I myself have not been surrounded by those types of Mennonites. I have witnessed the homophobia, I have witnessed the transphobia, And for a religion that is, it's a pacifist religion, the people don't seem very peaceful when they are talking about the queer community. When they are speaking about the 2S LGBTQIA community, there's just so much hate. It made me uncomfortable ever since I was a child. I would ask, like, why do you hate these people? In Sunday school, I would get in trouble for asking these questions. I was always somebody that would ask questions like this. There was never really an answer. It's just, well, they're sinners and they're going to burn in hell. And oh, it's like it's very triggering to say that. Sorry. My town actually and in surrounding towns, there's a huge problem with there are rainbow crosswalks that are vandalized frequently, and most of the time it's by Mennonites. So I know what you are dealing with, Kat. I know how strong the hatred is, and that's a big reason why I have distanced myself from that community, and also why I am sometimes quite embarrassed to even say that I am Mennonite. Like, even now, I'm like, oh, do I want to say it? And like, yeah, I am. But I don't identify with the religion at all.
Yeah, it can be, I mean, as somebody who isn't religious, I've never been religious, but have been raised in an extremely religious community. We don't even get, even though the city is, it's a big city. We have a hockey team, we have an airport. We don't get the rainbow crosswalks here. We don't get a pride flag during Pride Month. That is, and this is Canada. Like, this is largely, we associate Canada with being very inclusive, but
Yeah,
there are these creeping divides. And I think what I found so difficult in this entire story, not only the politicization of identity, which has been sick and is very cravenly for people to advance their own agendas. I think the other thing that's really hard is that generally, when we see mass shootings like this, it is so easy to immediately say like that's a villain. It often comes with like a manifesto, a statement, a desire for fame, that kind of thing, or a
yeah,
revenge or hating women, like something is very super not clear cut because no tragedy is ever clear cut, but a lot more direction to it. And this has been an incident where we have had the briefing from the RCMP who have said that this person, she was trans, was 18 years old, had suffered quite a lot of mental health episodes within the home that the police had had to attend to. And I know how difficult it is for people that I know who are trans in this city, with how large it is, to still be facing so much hatred. And with a city as tiny as Tumbler Ridge, without easy available access, like as close as Vancouver is to Abbotsford, sort of drivability, if you were in a more
mhm,
remote rural location in this country, I can imagine it's probably a lot more challenging to find access to not just gender affirming care or community to be in, but also to mental health support. And
yeah,
all of these things are sort of weaving through this story in a very different way where I can't just immediately write off like that evil guy who was out doing this, because usually it is a guy. This is a woman. This is a person in a vulnerable community who was having mental health issues. And I don't know. I don't want to say that I sympathize with. I know people will get very angry, and I don't even know if that's necessarily the feelings that I identify with. But at the same time, I feel so sad for how hard and that might have been for her to be in such a remote place and going through so much.
I
Does that sound
think
awful to say?
um I listen, I think for me personally, like what I think is really important to kind of come back to, CBC had the deputy director at the Violence Prevention Project and also a criminology professor at Metropolitan State University in Minnesota. His name is James Densley, and we'll link that interview because I thought it was really, really interesting. But this is an expert from the States on mass shootings and specifically the people who carry out this type of violence. Because unfortunately, in the States, there is a lot of data available. And I do just want to highlight for anybody listening, it's really important. They did say transgender individuals are underrepresented among people who carry out attacks with firearms. So, what that means is that when you look at how many people there are in a population who are transgender, and then you look at how many people fall under certain identities when you're looking at all of the people who carry out these types of attacks, it means that technically, if you're going by population size and ratio, there would be more there quote unquote should be more transgender people who carry out these attacks, but there aren't. There really aren't. You just really,
Yeah.
it's really important to emphasize this is so rare. I forget the exact number, but it was over 200 shootings that they were looking at, and there was one person identifying as transgender, despite the population actually having a larger percentage. So that's really, really important. I just really, really want to highlight that. And then another thing that they said is that more than like in a lot of these cases, identity isn't brought up because it's just so often male, right? That
Yeah.
we don't even really acknowledge that that gender is a thing, and so this particular situation is different. That's the only reason it's being highlighted is because it's so rare. But the reality is that there are other factors that are much more relevant, and a huge one is people's engagement online, the type of content they're taking in, and radicalization. In addition, he said, and I really liked his phrasing, he said it's not so much about mental illness, it's that a lot of individuals who carry out these attacks aren't mentally well. I really liked that phrasing. I
Yes.
really appreciated that. I think that's an important distinction as well.
That is so important because, a lot of the times people have this idea in their head that people with mental illnesses are violent, and that's just not the case.
Yeah.
So I think that distinction is very important to make.
Mhm.
But Kat, coming to back, like you did ask the question, is that terrible to consider? Like I'll be honest, and again, I'm intellectualizing a lot of this. That my mind went there as well. Like, okay, I'm just a problem solver in these situations. So it's like, okay, what was the situation? What led to this? How do we make sure that this literally never happens again? Like that's totally where my mind is. And
Yeah.
based on the information that is available, a couple of things it immediately pointed to was like, okay, healthcare access. That's really important discussion to
Yeah.
have. Obviously fighting back against misinformation about the trans community. And none of us are trans or have identified openly as trans. I think that's a really important thing to mention for anybody listening. We are allies and members of the queer community. And so that's really important to fight back against that misinformation. That's really like, there's also so much information that's not available and will probably come out in the coming times or
Yeah.
in the weeks to come. I would be curious to understand more about how firearms, the regulations around firearms are relevant, and also how healthcare access is relevant to this specific case. I think that's really interesting or really important to look into. Sorry, I'm rambling. This is where, yeah, this is
No.
my
No.
brain. This is my brain in a crisis.
I
I'm also worried, or not worried, but I'm wondering, since there had been reports of this individual having mental health crises and police visiting the home,
mhm.
how did she gain access to these firearms? Were they not properly locked away because it seems very irresponsible to have them. It seems irresponsible for them to not be locked up and for her to have access to them
Yeah,
since she does have this history.
well, and the police have come out, the RCMP came out, and that was one of the first things they talked about. The weapons were a long gun and a modified handgun. And the police clarified that previously, a few years back, there had been guns in the home that were removed by the RCMP after they determined that was a danger to, I believe, as the police characterized it, to herself at the time. They were talking about
Okay.
self-harm that was
Yeah.
happening, and the guns were removed. Also, um, she had had a minor's license, minor like a juvenile license for firearms, and was known to be, this was reported by the police, was known to be familiar with firearms. Tumbler Ridge is a very remote community in an area with a lot of like bears, so that is not unusual. I know
All
internationally people
right.
think of Canada as not having guns. We do have guns, and especially if you live in an area that has bears, that's more, common in rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
So she was actively a target shooter, and that was reported by police. However, there were guns in the home that were not owned by um, this person, and they had been removed. But the legal gun owner petitioned the courts to have them returned. So even though the RCMP deemed that it was not safe to have them in the house and they had them removed, they couldn't keep them. They had petitioned the courts to have them returned back, so the RCMP legally had to return them back. And that is definitely something that I question. If the RCMP were forced by the courts, if there was some sort of loophole, I'm not really sure how that worked, but the fact that the legal gun owner, who was not this juvenile person, petition to have them back, knowing that there was a danger in the home, is really concerning for me. We have very strict gun laws in Canada. This does not happen. Like it's an extremely rare thing to occur. So if this is some small loophole that maybe needs to be looked at, or if it was just a
Yeah.
freak occurrence kind of a thing, once in a lifetime, hopefully never again, I'm not sure.
That's definitely concerning.
Because there are a lot of
I
regulations against you. I believe you're not allowed, as far as I'm aware, you're not allowed to own a weapon if you have a history of mental health issues, I believe. I could be wrong.
I was just looking this up earlier because I believe so. I don't think I would be allowed to own a firearm because I do have bipolar disorder and panic disorder, OCD. I have quite a few mental illnesses. And I did look it up. I am in treatment. I have a psychiatrist, I have a therapist, I'm on medication. It's all under control. I'm good. But I was curious, and yeah, there is like a mandatory disclosure. I believe
Yeah.
you have to disclose if you've been treated for depression or a mental illness within, I think, the last 5 years.
Mhm.
Or if you have had any emotional and behavioral problems, you need to disclose that as well. That's my understanding of it. But I also, like I said, I've never tried to get one. I'm not completely sure about the process.
It
Yeah,
said
it's part of the application.
the police were clear that um, the shooter did have a minor license that was it expired in 2024 and no longer had any guns registered to her. There was another incident in the home in 2023, so preceding that, in which she set fire to a bed in a mental health and substance use combination situation that happened. But after that point, the license seems to have lapsed, and there was, to the RCMP's knowledge, they don't know who owned the guns. They aren't saying, but that adds some context there. I think there were a lot. I'm sure there's going to be so much more to come. There is a lot that has been reported by the Globe and Mail, by CBC, by the RCMP directly, where, like I said, there was this incident in the home. There had been guns removed previously, and also she had gone into treatment in Prince George, which is about 400 kilometers away from Tumbler Ridge. They weren't under an enhanced form of mental health supervision, like extended leave during the incident, but previously had spent weeks receiving treatment there for a major depressive disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder.
I that's also something I think that's really important to highlight again with this is that a lot of times, and this unfortunately is part of the conversation when it comes to gender affirming care being denied in provinces like Alberta, which we can certainly touch on later. But a lot of the times, transgender individuals, it's very common to suffer from depression and other and mental illness and mental disorders, quote unquote. I know that those terms, we all have thoughts and feelings about those terms, but it is that is more, that's the concern, right? Like, it doesn't have to do with somebody's gender identity. At the end of the day, somebody's
Yeah.
gender identity doesn't make you do these things.
Mhm.
That's not what it is. It is about, and again, coming back to what the criminology professor had emphasized, is that most of the times it's about an existential crisis, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is, it's not about gender dysphoria. It's not about other factors that coincide with an individual, like in the overall picture of an individual's mental health.
Mhm.
When you're depressed, people take their own lives when they're depressed. People take other people's lives sometimes when they're depressed, and that is a very serious condition that needs to be taken seriously, and there are so many people who are suffering without access to treatment.
Mhm. I mean,
Yeah.
400 kilometers away for the nearest place to receive treatment seems pretty far. I know, I mean, Canada's a very large
Definitely.
place, but that is not somewhere you can get to quickly if something was happening at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like if you were
Yeah.
having some sort of episode that needed intervention, that Tumbler Ridge was not a place with a hospital even, which is a
Wow.
lot of the rural communities in this country.
Yeah.
So we are in a situation, and the first responders and the medical professionals there have done amazing things, and all credit to them. The RCMP said there would have been more loss of life had the people who worked in the small clinic in town not been so immediate with triage. So
Mhm.
I am so thankful for that. But when we talk about healthcare, we often refer to the body, which I will say in British Columbia, and I don't want to go on a side rant on that, but we have been having our own provincial healthcare problems. Wait lists are very long to get a regular, just a GP in this
Mhm.
Yeah.
province.
Yeah.
People for surgeries are waiting a long time, and while we are neglecting the body, we are seriously falling down on the job on mental health care ever since they closed down Riverview in the early 2000s. And that was only in the lower mainland that they were helping people really. So I don't know, like mental health care also, to my knowledge, is not, unless it's something that requires hospitalization, I don't believe it's covered.
A huge issue, especially just speaking as somebody who lives in British Columbia specifically, is that a lot of times care is only available if it's urgent and you're already in crisis. So, like in Vancouver, for example, there is an outpatient clinic. You can go into it, but it's that we don't do a very good job of preventative care. Things already need to be quite dire for you to get any kind of treatment, let alone free treatment, let alone, being directed to the right type of treatment. Because a lot of times people are waiting years to get into, like, say, a DBT group, for example, for a
Yeah.
6 month program that is maybe meeting once a week, sometimes meeting as little as once a month. And the reality is that that's not adequate. That's not adequate care a lot of the times. So for anybody who hasn't had the experience of seeking mental health care treatment, seeing a counselor once a week or even regularly, like a couple times a month, oftentimes is not available to most individuals unless it's already past a certain threshold. Otherwise, most people are paying out of pocket, going through insurance through work, which is a whole other issue, right? Because obviously, a lot of people who are experiencing chronic mental health care issues or mental health issues are not able to work. So, but I don't know, Marta. Like I'm not sure how it is in Ontario. That's just a little bit of how it is here. I'm not sure if
Uh,
it's similar.
yeah, I can definitely speak about my experience because I have a lot of experience navigating the mental health care system over here ever since I was a child, really. And I will say what you said, a lot of the times care isn't really given until something dire happens. And I'm going to put a trigger warning right here. I'm going to be speaking about self harm. So if you do not want to listen to that, maybe we can put a little timestamp where you can skip to. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 17 years old, and there was one psychiatrist in my town at the time, and she was very religious, and she unfortunately brought that into her practice, which is very unethical.
Yeah.
But eventually, she did put me on some medication, which didn't work for me, and so I went back and was gaslit by her. And so I stopped taking that medication because it was giving me really bad side effects, and she wouldn't put me on any other medication. And so I went unmedicated for a while, and when I turned 18, I tried to take my own life and was finally admitted to a hospital, a psychiatric ward in a hospital. And even though I had been struggling for so long, it took me trying to take my own life for the healthcare system to finally allow me to have a bed in the psychiatric ward because I had been to the hospital so many times, experiencing, a crisis, and I was just sent home. So it did take something like that for them to finally take me seriously. I will say I was lucky that I spent time in the psych ward because I was able to be referred to a wonderful psychiatrist who I still have, and they are amazing and they listen to me and they validate my feelings, and I am very, very, very lucky. But I know that I am also a white woman and I am very privileged in that sense because there is a lot of medical abuse and neglect that goes on in the healthcare system, especially when it comes to mental health. And I myself have experienced this. I've made a few videos about this, about medical abuse and neglect. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because once you experience that, it makes you kind of not want to seek help again because you're scared. And I posted a few threads about this, and I think I made some healthcare professionals a little bit angry. But I did say that, there's so many discussions online from healthcare workers, nurses and doctors specifically speaking about the abuse that they endure while they are working. But whenever disabled or chronically ill people with mental illness try to have conversations about how they have been abused by healthcare professionals, those healthcare professionals shut down the conversation and they make excuses and they say, well, you were probably being abusive to us, and so we were justified. And it can be very difficult because you want to get help, but also you receive very poor treatment a lot of the times. It's a very, very sad situation. I am lucky that I was able to get help, but I am sad that I had to endure abuse at the hands of medical professionals because it has created this distrust now that I have in them.
I thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm sure that's really a lot of people can probably relate, maybe not themselves, but maybe family members or have experienced that. I think mental health touches a lot more of us than maybe we talk about.
Yeah.
and talking especially about the prejudices that come with being somebody identified within the medical system as then having some sort of a mental health concern. I think that is also something that we don't talk about basically ever.
Yeah.
And I think I think for me, this also it ties very into when I think of what was happening here with a remote community that there had to be travel 400 kilometers to go and get mental
Yeah.
health treatment. And in addition, so reporting from the Globe and Mail, they have said that there is implications or evidence that there was self-treatment at home that was happening, experiments with different types of
Like
psychedelics,
supplements? Oh,
or like
psychedelics.
their own sort of at home, and that's from the Globe and Mail's reporting. Obviously, there's a lot more that will actually come out in detail, I'm sure, as the investigation progresses. But I would just ask, like, do you, and I don't know if this is fair to ask, but is it common for people who are experiencing mental health conditions who are not getting proper care to be self-treating in ways at home that can become
Um,
harmful? Like, is that something that we should be talking more about and being more aware and is that like a warning sign, I guess, for lack of a better term? Should we be paying attention to the people in our lives who are self-medicating?
I definitely think it's very important to be paying attention to the people in your lives that you know are dealing with mental health issues. In any case, I will say if they were experimenting with, you said psychedelic drugs.
That's according
Um,
to the Globe and Mail.
yes. So I will say that mental health conditions, I know this is true of bipolar. Taking psychedelic drugs can actually cause you to go into drug-induced psychosis. I mean, anybody can be at risk of going into drug-induced psychosis when you take psychedelics,
Mhm.
but if you have a mental illness such as bipolar, schizophrenia, even just depression, you are at a much higher risk of going into a drug-induced psychosis, and that can be extremely dangerous. So self-medicating,
Mhm.
a lot of people do turn to that because of desperation, but it is quite dangerous.
Mhm.
Like taking any medication without talking to a doctor about it
Mhm.
has risks
Right.
because you don't know, you might have certain physical illnesses and those medications might not be good for you because it could cause you harm, or if you're on any other medication, it could interact with that.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a very dangerous thing to do.
To be clear, the Globe and Mail hasn't said that that was happening at the time at the time of Tuesday, that just that this
Yeah.
was part of the history of the troubles that were happening within this home.
I think, well, I mean, not think, we do know that one thing that is very common when healthcare is less accessible or even almost entirely inaccessible is that people are more vulnerable to things like the wellness pipeline,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
kind of often the beginning of, for many people, the alt-right pipeline, if you will, and kind of goes down the eugenics pipeline. There's good reason for that because, like you were talking about, Kat, I mean, if you don't have access to healthcare with professionals, a lot of times people are looking for solutions themselves, and there are a lot of amazing remedies that do impact, especially mental health. Like exercise is good for your body and therefore for your health. Gut health is important for mental health. Diet is important for mental health. Like these all are important and have an impact on an individual. It's just that it is very, very common for people to start to, out of desperation, look at these things as kind of like the solution or the be all end all, when in reality, there need to be other treatments present as well. that's for everybody to decide with their own doctors. And ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, it is. We all have bodily autonomy, knock on wood,
Yes.
right? And so ultimately, like, we get to decide how we are going to treat ourselves. And I mean,
Yes.
there's a whole discussion to have there when it comes to mental health, and specifically when a person's mental health does impact others, specifically when it comes to crime, right? So that is a difficult discussion to have. And, you know, obviously a case like this, I think, kind of highlights it. But I think what's really important is for a lot of Canadians to look at a situation like this and recognize, okay, so we have some cracks here for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We have some cracks to identify what makes people more vulnerable to seeking treatment on their own, right? What makes people more vulnerable to maybe having intervention that isn't helpful. Yeah, so in a situation like this, I think, or I hope, that a lot of people, rather than engaging in quote unquote culture war, i.e., focusing on the identity of people involved, hopefully we can sort of set our sights a little higher and look at the systemic issues and how something like this um, becomes more likely slash less likely. So one of those things is, as we've been talking about, healthcare. I think a lot of Canadians understand that currently universal healthcare isn't entirely universal, and there's lots of work to be done. We don't have entirely universal pharmacare as it stands, mental health care also, and we've made some progress with dental, but there are definitely cracks in our system that we need to look at. But then also, what's really important, I think, to look at, especially, and something like this especially does highlight it, is social media regulation. As it stands, we have these private interests, most of which are American owned, a lot of American owned social media companies that really don't have an interest in protecting young people, right? Because it doesn't, that's not part of the business model. It doesn't make them money, and if anything, it actually costs them money, because proper moderation, as we've seen time and time again, is often handed over to like automated systems, right? And I think, like, you know, even just the fact that Tara Armstrong, as we had that MLA that we mentioned earlier, there's a reason why, you know, that post was made on X. X is, I hope I hope that even many people who have maybe voted conservative in the past, people who have considered themselves to be conservatives or part of the quote unquote right wing, I hope that even some of those people would have started to recognize just how problematic a platform like X is, especially for kids. And, you know, like, to recently have all of these images created, these AI images created of kids in inappropriate, like with yeah, I don't want to, you know, get into the details of that, but like, basically that platform has reached a point where people can create CSAM. Like, it is a cesspool that is causing more harm than it is doing good in connecting people.
I think it's
Yeah.
really crazy that in this time we still have so many of our government officials using Twitter/X/ whatever. I do know that New Brunswick came out with a statement saying that their province isn't going to be using it anymore. But it seems like so many MPs, MLAs, different government bodies still use it as their primary source of social media communication. And just find that really, it's 2026. What are we doing?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I understand. I mean, well, first of all, there was a time where it wasn't what it is today. So that's understandable. I do understand wanting to be on those platforms to counter a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and also to be a source for people across the political spectrum, but I think, it is really important to, like we've done with other entertainment news sources, quote unquote news sources, to just acknowledge when something is not in the public health interest. And I do think that X is. I'm also I'm usually pretty hesitant to say, like, oh, we should ban something entirely. When it comes to freedom of expression, I'm always cautious. It's easy to say that we should do something when you agree with the government's decision. But I think that this is a case where we really should very seriously consider not allowing it in Canada, because as it stands, the spread of mis and disinformation is too far gone. We are very much outnumbered. And by that, I mean like the literal population of Canada as compared to the amount of foreign influence. It's more than we can process, like not only as individuals, but also like our systems that are meant to protect us. It's more than they can process. So I think we are at that point where we do kind of need to have a bit of a firewall for some things. And I think X is one of those things.
We've seen this month in the UK, in January in the UK and other places around the world who have talked about banning X in general because of the AI, like we mentioned. And AI is becoming a even bigger thing. When things like this happen, there's a lot of information that comes out really quickly. And I think we saw this week how little we can trust just the bad faith of humans, just in general, spreading misinformation, but also there was all kinds of graphics and data sets and numbers that people were pulling out of thin air. I don't know if they have like propaganda press kits that they're using, but I worry how much worse and how much worse, faster, like closer to events, things like this will happen. Um, and so I think keeping an eye on the social media is going to be very, I don't even know how we stop this. I don't like, I don't even know. I just keep thinking of all of the trauma that everybody trauma that I know this is
Yeah.
very rare in Canada. I know it's happened a ton in the States for many, many years. I remember Columbine when I was in high school. And I just think about how many people this is going to affect.
Yeah, that actually brings me to something that I wanted to bring up, which is it's something I've been thinking about ever since this happened, and it's the Sandy Hook tragedy. I'm sure everybody is familiar with this, but on December 14th, 2012, there was a mass shooting event at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut. There were 26 victims, 20 children, 6 adults, and this was a huge tragedy. And recently, it was the anniversary of this tragedy, December 14th. So a few months ago, a lot of the survivors of that mass shooting event have been making TikToks, especially around the time of the anniversary, but even now. And I've been watching a lot of them, and they're in their early 20s now, and they spoke about how this event has changed their lives and how they are still dealing with the effects of it every day, the PTSD that they have, thinking about the friends that they lost and the horrific scenes that they witnessed. And it makes me so sad for the victims of the Tumbler Ridge shooting and their families, because I know that they're going to be dealing with this trauma forever. They're going to need so much support, especially when it comes to therapy and mental health support. And I really hope that it is made accessible to them, because it can be hard to access mental health, as we've been discussing. And it can also be expensive. Therapy isn't always covered. I know that these survivors, they are going to need a lot of therapy. They are going to need a lot of mental health support, and their families are as well. And it really brings up another thing that I wanted to mention, which is I think that mental health care should definitely be covered under universal health care. Therapy, especially because it can be very expensive. Mental health care is health care, and it's such an essential part of our overall health because it affects our physical health as well.
Mhm.
And I know that the Canadian Mental Health Association has advocated for this, and I just kind of wanted to read an excerpt of something that I found on their website, and we can link this below as well. So it says universal mental health care is essential for our well being. Just like physical health, mental health is important to living a fully engaged life, yet getting services can be difficult and they are not available to everyone. Many of the services and supports we need aren't currently covered by public health insurance plans. Many of us can't afford to pay for services like counseling, psychotherapy, eating disorder treatments, substance abuse, and addictions treatment, and only some people have access to these services through private health insurance plans. Cost shouldn't get in the way of care. Everyone should be able to get the supports they need, whoever they are, wherever they are, whatever they need. Universal mental health care would not only reduce overall health care and other social costs, but it is essential for our well being. And I think that they put that perfectly.
Mhm.
And yeah, I'm just thinking about how traumatized the survivors of this event are going to be and how traumatized the family members of the victims are going to be. And it truly breaks my heart. And I can't even imagine the pain that they are experiencing right now. And I really, really, really hope that they are able to access the support that they are going to need for a long time.
I'm really glad that in their statement they mentioned that universal mental health care does also reduce long-term costs and pressures on our systems. I think that's really important. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but preventative care is always less expensive in the long run, and it's really really important. Leads to happier people and a happier population, and also a more productive population under capitalism, if you're really focused on that. But in the meantime, we don't have that, and there are a couple of ways that people can donate to help support the families in this time. There is a GoFundMe, and we will link it, but understandably, a lot of Canadians might be hesitant to support a GoFundMe given some of the experiences been that have happened in recent years. So there's also the Red Cross, and that is what the province of BC is directing people to donate to. We'll keep you updated if you follow us on threads, like if there are better resources or if there are any changes to those current resources. We'll let you guys know there, and we'll also make a note in the comments here as well. But that's probably one of the best ways that Canadians can help support these families at this time. And also, I think, just like both of you have said in different ways, showing compassion generally. This is not the time to politicize this horrifically tragic event. At the end of the day, like you said, Marta, it's people's lives have been impacted forever, and that should be the focus.
Yeah, I mean, this has been so helpful for me to try to process as somebody who's obviously not part of that community, but it still impacts all of us to be going through this. I think talking it through with friends helps. I've been talking it through with family because this is so, it's not on a scale that we've experienced, obviously, in Canada, or experiences the frequency of other places, but I think a lot of people are still really in the shock phase of what's going on. This is so fresh, and I think this is going to be news for quite some time to come. And I personally am really, I think so far I've just been living in the anger stage of being so mad at the people using this to their own advantage and how gross that is. Um,
Yeah.
And I really, really hope that rhetoric goes away. And I hope people like that MLA Tara Armstrong from Kelowna is absolutely taking a task on what she's done. I think she's done a lot of harm this week. And I will probably continue to call out content creators on TikTok who make this about themselves or their platforms because I think that's gross. But that's just where I'm coming from with it so far. And yeah, just thinking about how this has forever altered an entire city. You know, it's not just
Yeah.
those specific people who lost someone, but everybody in that town will be impacted forever.
Yeah. They definitely will, and trauma is a heavy thing to carry around with you every day.
Mhm.
And especially for such young children. I don't even have words. I My heart just breaks for them.
Um, I I don't know how to end this. Bailey, do you have any final thoughts maybe that we'll end on?
Yes. Lastly, we are going to make sure to include some resources for anybody who's struggling at this time. We'll include that in links below, as well as numbers, hotlines, all of the things. And I think that if you're somebody who isn't necessarily directly impacted by this, I think one thing that is really helpful is just normalizing sharing those resources with people. I think that's a really great thing that people who maybe might not know a lot about the situation can do, because at the end of the day, we can always use access to mental health care, and the more we know about the resources that are available, the more that hopefully people will use them, and and we can all see value in them and advocate for them and for their existence.
And take away any stigma that might still remain around seeking care when you need it, because all of us can use that sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.